Check out this innocuous little NextJS 13 client-side component. Now, you wouldn't think that it's all that terrifying, but it is, because in fact, it actually looks like it's working. It displays data in your page, but it's actually running a huge number of requests to your server, an infinite loop of requests. So what's going on here? I mean, let's take a look at this component. Up at the top, you have use client, which is Next.js 13's way of saying that this is a client-side component. Then you've got this pretty good looking fetch data function that goes and gets the data. Seems like it's a logical thing to do. And then we define our component where we use the new use hook to listen to the promise that comes out of fetch data. So how could this go wrong? Well, I'm going to tell you about that right after the spiffy graphic intro. But before we get into that, I'm sure some folks are like, hey, Jack, you covered this exact topic just a couple of weeks ago. What's going on? Well, a couple of things. First, I've seen this code out in the wild with people recommending that this is the way to do this, and when it is in fact an infinite loop, so I want to cover it. Second, between now and then, Next.js 13 came out. Next.js 13 has support for both the client-side stuff that we looked at in the previous video, but also React server components, which I'm going to cover in this video. And then third, I'm coming up with a much better way of doing the promise caching, and I wanted to show that to you as well. So let's get right into it. Okay, so I've got my iTerm up here. I'm going to go and create a new Next.js 13 application by specifying that I want a create next step at latest. And then I'm going to also specify the experimental app directory. And that's going to go into next 13 use warning, which is of course linked to in the description right down below. So I'm going to say I do want TypeScript and I do want ESLint. And I'll bring it up in VS Code. All right, so if you're not familiar with Next.js 13, we have a new directory called app, and that's where your pages go. So why do we have a pages directory? Well, we have a pages directory because the API routes, where you get one of those by default, this hello route, are still over in the pages directory. Apparently, there may be some changes where those two go somewhere else. Who knows? But that's why we have a pages directory. But this app directory is where, for example, our page goes. So this is the current contents of this last page, and we're just going to get rid of all this. Cool. And let's fire this up. And I'll click on localhost 3000 and looks good. An empty page. Awesome. So if I go to API hello here, I do get some JSON data, just like that. So let's use that. Let's make that request. And this is a server component. By default, all of your components in Next.js 13 are going to be server components that run only and exclusively on the server unless you say that it's a client component. But let's not do that because we want to check out what this React server component stuff is about. So we're going to display the data from that API hello right on the page. So first we got to go request it. So we'll do a fetch. And we would get API hello, but this is running on the server, so we need to make an absolute URL. And so that's giving us back a promise. And what we can do in React Server Components is we can just await that promise. But of course, we can't await because this isn't an asynchronous function. But here's the trick. We can just make it an async function. And that works. Now I can go get the data from that. But of course, I have to await that as well. And now we can just put the data into our page. And there you have it. Cool, right? I mean, if you come out of like the PHP world, this looks really good. And the really cool thing about this is if you have nested components, they can also all make those async fetches. Now, there are some downsides to that potentially. I mean, you could have a component that is deeply nested, that makes a bunch of requests, and that could be a performance problem. It could also mean a bunch of renders on the server, which is not great. So you probably still want to treat this like get server-side props and do most of your requesting at the top level, and then drill or context it down to your other components. But this is really cool. Okay, So let's start our path towards getting into the client side now. So this is a full-on React server component. It's not running on the client at all. So let's turn it into a client component. And the first thing we need to do is we need to go up to the top and we need to say use client. And that tells NextJS that this is a client-side component. Now I just hit save. Bad things will happen because objects are not valid as React children. And we're returning a promise. We're returning a promise because this is an async function. So we need to take out the async that we just put in. So it has to go back to being a normal kind of React component that we've been seeing for years now. Of course, now we can't do this cool await stuff. So we need to use the use hook so that we can use a promise. So let's bring that in. And now what we can do is we can just wrap this fetch in a use. And of course, we want to get the data too. So let's do it then to get the data. So now we have data coming out. Cool, and let's save. And it looks like it's working, right? It's up there. But here's the rub. So let's go over to our inspector and take a look at our network panel and look at what's going on over the network panel. We are just getting flooded with requests to the server, and this is gonna chew on bandwidth like nobody's business. So this is really bad. So let's talk about why this is happening. Well, let's go take a look over the code. So what's happening is that we render home. Home is executing this fetch that's going off and making an asynchronous request. That returns a promise, which gets given to this use. And then we follow through to the JSON stringify with the data. The data is currently null, so it just is null. And then once this fetch returns, finally through all of this JSON getting back and all that, it returns essentially back that JSON that we had, the data. So use then stores that data, presumably as state within use, and that forces a re-render of home, which again creates another fetch. But if you're like, hey, Jack, you're wrong. This is exactly the same fetch that we had before. That's true. It is exactly the same, essentially, contents of the fetch. It's the same process, but it's not the same reference to the promise. And that's what use is looking at. We're giving it a new promise, and use is like, okay, I guess I need to rerun that. And it goes off and it reruns it and gets the data, and it's just a continuous loop. So I've seen folks try to get around this by creating a local function, call that fetch data, that does basically this. So we're going to get the response of the fetch. So of course this needs to be an async function. And then we're going to return the JSON, which is itself a promise. So now let's put in the fetch data here. And this is going to work, right? I've seen this in articles. I've seen this in YouTube videos. This works, right? Sure it does. All right, we'll go over here, refresh. Boom, infinite loop. No. In fact, when I saw this, the first time I saw this in a video, I was like, okay, am I wrong? Am I crazy? This should not work. And I tried it out, exactly the same code. I'm like, oh, okay, yeah. It visually looks like it's working. It looks like there's good stuff on the page, and there is. But yeah, we're just absolutely pounding on the server at this point. So what do we do? Well, one thing we can do is we can just get the promise and then hold it and only use it once. And there we go. Now we are just looking at that one promise, which we got from fetch data, and we get the data back, and we only make the one request to the server, which is exactly what we want, right? And this is basically what I showed in the previous video as to how to solve this. But I actually think I want to go one better with this. So we're going to create a query client. And it's going to take a name for the query, as well as a query creator. So if I don't have the query, then I'm going to call this function and it's going to create the promise for me. It's going to be a function that returns a promise that will have any in it. And then what I want to do is I want to create a map between the name and the query. So let's go and create an externalized map of those. So let's go create an externalized map of those fetches. So this map is going to go from a name, which is a string, to a promise. So when we call this, we need to first check to see, is there a promise with that name already in the cache? And if there isn't, then we are going to set that value in the map to the result of the query function that we run. And then we're just going to return the promise that we have. So now we can use query client down here by saying that we have some data, hello, and then we just give it a fetcher function. And we will fetch that localhost API hello and return the JSON. Now it's complaining because that could be undefined, and use doesn't like undefined. So I'm just going to put an exclamation point here and get around that. Say, yeah, it's going to be in the map because we know right here we either have it and we returned it or we created a new one. So now let's finish up by getting rid of that data promise and fetch data. And let's see how we go. All right, cool. We have made exactly one request to hello, and we have a nice generic function here. This is really cool. The only way I think we can improve this is by making it actually TypeScript generic. And the way that we would do that is we capture the output of this promise. So we'd say query result. Then we would define that as a generic parameter. And we would say that the output of this query client function for that name is going to be a promise with that query result. And now if we take a look at data, we see that we're getting any as the type of that data. So what we could do here is we could say that, well, the fetch is going to return a promise for, like, let's say a message string. And now we can see over here that data now says that we have a message string, and that's because we're getting that mapping all the way through this query result. We see that the fetch is returning that promise, and then we map it through to the output of that query client. So we get nice type-safe behavior all the way through that query client. Now, if you're looking at this and saying this looks an awful lot like React Query and SWR, yeah, it does. Can't argue with you there. Now, another thing I wanted to do was show how to cascade use, because that's really cool. This uses the first hook that we can actually call conditionally, and I wanted to show that. So what we're going to do is we're going to build a quick Pokemon page, and we're going to have two different API routes that give us different information about our Pokemon. But the first thing we need to do is bring in some images of those Pokemon. So we got Bulbasaur, Charmander, Ivysaur, and Venusaur. You know, eventually I'm going to start like really knowing these Pokemon. I use them so often. And then we're going to go create a data directory. And that's going to have our Pokemon JSON that's going to have a list of those Pokemon with, you know, some IDs or whatever. Again, all of this code available to you on GitHub for free. So the first thing we need to do is have an endpoint that we can call to get this list of Pokemon. So let's go over here to our hello, and we're just going to clone this and create a new file called Pokemon.ts. And the idea of this /API/Pokemon route is that it's going to return that data. So we're going to import our Pokemon. And then we're just going to return it. So what do we put in here for the type of our Pokemon? Well, we can put on the type of the Pokemon. That's all you got to do. Pretty easy. So let's try this out. Let's go over to page. And then instead of calling hello, we'll call it Pokemon. And we'll call this request Pokemon as well. So that's cool. But it doesn't match this down here. What it really is ID, which is a number, and then name, which is a string, and it's an array of that. And let's rename this Pokemon. And then we will map through this to create buttons for each of our Pokemon. And when you click on them, we will then download the data for that Pokemon. All right, that doesn't look too bad, but let's go and make the CSS just a little bit better. So I'll get rid of that. And now, yeah, okay, so got some big buttons. Nice, okay. Okay, so what are we gonna do when we click on that? Well, we're gonna call another endpoint. And I would imagine something along the lines of localhost, API, and then the ID. So we need another API route. So let's go copy this one and make a new API route called bracket ID.ts. And what this is going to do is if we call, for example, /API/1, it's going to put 1 in as a query parameter to our function. So that's pretty cool. So what do we want to do? Well, we want to go and find the Pokemon that matches that query ID. So what is the type of this going to be? Well, the type of this is going to be either one of the items in the array or undefined. So how do we get the type of the one of the items in the array? Well, you just take any item in the array and you can get the type of that. So that covers the got a Pokemon case. And then we got to add on the undefined option. Not bad, but apparently we have an issue here. I think rec query ID would be a string. So let's cast that into a number. And that looks good. So now we need to store the Pokemon that we clicked on when we click that button, and then we can use that stored Pokemon to make a subsequent request for the data. So first we need some state to hold the button that we clicked on. And now when we do onClick, we can just set the selected Pokemon to whatever the current Pokemon is. But we got some typing problems, and that's because we think that the use state should always be undefined because we've initialized it to be undefined, and now we're saying it's going to be something else, like a Pokemon. So we need to reuse this definition of a Pokemon. So let's go and create a type for that. And then we'll reuse that down here, and also for our use state. Looking good and no issues. Great. So let's go click around and see if it works. Seems to. All right. So let's go get our data. So we're going to reuse this use here. Let's call this Pokemon detail. And then we're going to do the thing that we've never been able to do with hooks. This is super cool. So we're going to say if we have a selected Pokemon, then do that use, make that request. Otherwise, just set it to null. So this is a conditional request. Of course, it's not the right request. So the first thing we need to do is use the ID that we have on the selected Pokemon. Well, we also need to make a unique request name for this because Pokemon is already used. And if we make a request to Pokemon, we're just going to get the Pokemon data. So how do we do that? Well, one way to do that would be to go and create an array here. And then put in the Pokemon ID and then just join it. You can use whatever you want. I'll use a dash there. And let's see. So click, cool. And we can see the requests being made. Awesome. So let's go ahead and put out the data. Okay, let's go have a look. All right, cool. And we can see that when we go back and try and get the original values like 1, 2, 3, 4, we don't get them again because they're already in the cache. We're using those promises as our data cache. It's super cool. All right, let's go finish this off by making this look all pretty. The first thing we need to do is return an image from our API. So when you get it, you'll get back not just the Pokemon data, but also, so let's go and first get that Pokemon. And then we'll say that if we found a Pokemon, then we'll return all the Pokemon data plus an image, which is / and then the name of the Pokemon with a JPEG. And I think it's to lowercase. And otherwise, we'll return undefined. Cool. Now it's telling us, hey, this doesn't match a type of Pokemon 0. So what we can do is we can just say, hey, it's going to be a type of Pokemon 0, but it's also going to have an image. And that works. So we've added, using the ampersand, this object to this object, and the type of that then becomes the fusion of those two record types. Okay, so that looks good. So now let's go back over here, and yep, now we get our image. Awesome. And all we need to do is just go back into our page and then put it on me, and then replace this with a conditional that says, if we have a Pokemon detail, then put together an image where that source is that Pokemon detail dot image. But it's like, hey, we don't have an image on that. So let's go and add that to our Pokemon definition and say that we could have an image. Okay. Now this yellow underline is telling us that in NextJS, they want us to use the image component, whatever, you can deal with that. But let's take a look. Nice. Okay, cool. A very nice little client-side Pokemon selector that uses the use hook in a very clean way using our query client. But if we want to take it one step further, I know a lot of folks in the previous video like, ooh, you got a global there with fetch map. That's terrifying. That's terrible. Okay, fine. Let's go and wrap this query client in a query client creator. And then we'll return the query client that we just created. And then we'll use make query client to instantiate a query client. And now that fetch map is just within that closure. So it's no longer a global. And of course, you can go and take that make query client function, take it out, put it into another module, import it here, whatever you want to do. It's all up to you. Of course, all of this code is available to you on GitHub for free in the link in the description down below. But in the meantime, if you have any questions or comments, be sure to put those also in the comment section. It's also down below. And of course, if you like the video, hit that like button. If you really like the video, hit the subscribe button and click on that bell. And every couple of weeks, you will get a new Blue Collar Coder video. See you next time.